What's going on, everyone? So I have an exciting video for you today because this is our first Twin Suns deck list for everyone watching. And for those of you that are not familiar with this format in Star Wars Unlimited, it is not your typical one. It is a singleton format, meaning that you play only one copy of each card in your deck. It is still 50 card decks, but you also get to play with two different leaders and a base, of course. And on top of all that, it is a multiplayer format in which politics are king. So it is definitely a very different experience. And if you ever played something like Commander in Magic, it is very similar to that. So when we're going to go through the cards, I do want to note that when we're looking at these cards, you have to look at it through the lens of potentially a 4-player game. It's usually 3 to 4 players. You can do 1v1 Twin Suns. People do it for fun, but technically the format is a multiplayer 3 to 4 player format in which everyone's free-for-alling. And so some cards that might be really good in, 1v1, 50 card, 3 copies max deck lists might not be as interesting. For example, more aggressive decks kind of put the target on your back. Today's video, though, has Krennic and Grand Inquisitor. This was the Twin Suns list that I wanted to create more than anything, mainly because I think the synergy of Grand Inquisitor and Krennic's leader actions, or in Krennic's case, just leader ability, is pretty sweet. And the combination of these two guys gives you a lot of power on the battlefield in terms of just pumping up your units and, well, being maybe a little aggressive. We want to be careful about it, though, because people will get mad and they'll start focusing you down. So without further ado, let's talk about Krennic and Grand Inquisitor and why I actually chose these two leaders. If you would like to pick up any of the cards here that I'm featuring, or if you want to pick up this deck list, I will have a link to the deck list as well as my TCG player link down below. Feel free to use it. It helps me out, helps you out. And let's talk about Krennic first off. So the idea behind Krennic is his static leader ability, giving all of your damaged units +1/+0, works really well just in general, but also with Grand Inquisitor's action to deal damage to his own units in order to ready them up. Now, what's interesting about this is, unlike normal Grand Inquisitor lists where you're trying to ready things up to attack your opponents just non-stop, you might want to ready up your units to potentially go ahead and trade with your opponent's units, or just potentially deal with the biggest threat on the board. As again, if you're trying to focus down a specific player or a specific couple of players, they will potentially band together against you. So you do have to manage this pretty nicely in order for you not to get focused down. But if you think about it, something like Krennic plus Scout Bike Pursuer was already good, right? 1/4 grit, and we're going to talk about that unit in just a moment. But then you add the Grand Inquisitor, and suddenly you're dealing 2 damage to your Scout Bike Pursuer on turn 1. It is now a 3/2, but then becomes a 4/2 through Krennic. So you have a 4/2 that can immediately attack on turn 1. Pretty amazing synergy. Following that up, we also have separate resource deploy units, leaders here in 5 and 6. Krennic comes down on turn 4. He's going to be able to restore 2 and still keep that static ability with a pretty nice body. I generally speaking like the higher toughness leaders in Twin Suns, as it kind of discourages your opponents from attacking into it, because it kind of feels like a waste of time trying to take these guys out, and that allows you to kind of build up a better board state. Grand Inquisitor comes down the turn after, and he is a 3/6, which generally speaking I like less than Krennic in terms of stats, but he does have that on attack to deal 1 damage to a friendly unit, which essentially gives it +1 power and readies it, assuming they have 3 or less power, which can be pretty cool. You can also just do this to Krennic himself, as you can potentially attack with Krennic, restore 2, then ready up Grand Inquisitor, attack, ready up Krennic to deal damage to him, and then go ahead and restore 2 again, which is a pretty nice synergy. So pretty sweet leaders here. That also gives us the red and blue color pairings, followed up with our green base. Now, despite us playing green here, I do not like Energy Conversion Lab. I do not like the 25 HP bases in Twin Suns. The extra 5 health is extremely relevant, as again, you're dealing with potentially 3 opposing players that can easily just knock you down to, well, maybe losing 20-25 HP in a single turn, which can be really, really gross. So you have to be careful, and I think the 30 HP bases rise up in value. And instead of playing yellow, I think green is the key here, as not only are we in green for ramp, but we're also in villainy. So we get the villainy green ramp cards that we can play, which is really, really nice. So that is the leader and base that we're running, or the leaders and base that we're running. Let's talk about ground units. So a little bit different today, as we have one-ofs. As I mentioned, we cannot play more than one copy of a single card. So I just want to briefly go through each individual card here and kind of why they're good, why they're interesting for the deck. What you'll notice with this deck overall is it has a higher resource cost. As in, you don't really necessarily need to focus on the early game as much. You do want to early game play so that you don't just get run over. You know, if you have no units on the battlefield, people will start to target you. It's just how it goes, okay? But you don't want to go ahead and necessarily be limited to weaker units. You do want to play a lot of the higher end if you can. Things like 5 and up resource costed units, because you will be able to get a little deeper into the game in multiplayer, as again, people are a little bit more afraid to attack and be on the aggressive. As such, let's talk about some of the units we have. We have a little package of 2 resource units, 5 ground units. We have the Scout Bike Pursuer, Seasoned Shore Trooper, Colonel Yularen, Piet, and the Snow Trooper. I'm going to briefly, as I said, go through these because we have a lot of cards to talk about. Scout Bike Pursuer just synergizes really well with the 2 leader abilities. Just a really solid body. It ends up being a 4-2 on turn 1. Seasoned Shore Trooper, also just a solid body, as you will end up making it a 4-3 a little bit later on. Colonel Yularen gives you a little bit of HP restoration. This could be really nice if you just keep this on the battlefield and get some static value from it. Admiral Piet, this is a card I don't like playing until, around turn 5, so that you could go ahead and, or turn 4, so that you can go ahead and take advantage of the ambush effect from your higher quality units. In particular, the Reinforcement Walker works exceptionally well with it. The First Legion Snow Trooper, very similar to Seasoned Shore Trooper, just attacks as a very powerful unit and is a 2-3. Then we talk about our 3 units, 3 resource costed units, starting off with Super Laser Technician. This is one of, if not the best unit in the whole deck. And you might be like, oh, well, isn't it just a ramp? Yep, it's just ramp, but it potentially gives you a little bit of extra value by training with an opponent's unit. And ramp is extremely important in this type of format, at least in my play group and the people that I've played with. I've noticed that ramp has just been really, really powerful as you do get to those later game plays. Del Mico, this one's really nice because it's each event and opponent play, so it counts all 3 of your opponents, and it's just a 3-3 with restore 1. Any restore card ends up being pretty solid. Fifth Brother, this one's pretty nice. Again, just ends up being a really powerful unit with Grand Inquisitor and Krennic's leader abilities. You can immediately ready this up with Krennic, or with Grand Inquisitor, making it essentially a 4-2 on attacks. But then you also have to add your Krennic buff, which is a 5-2, and then you also get the ping. You could ping itself and the unit, so you could essentially attack for 7 the turn this thing comes down, which is pretty crazy between everything that's going on. Cell Block Guard, just a little early game sentinel if you're getting beat down from someone who doesn't know the actual rules of Twin Suns. You can't be really playing aggressive decks in Twin Suns. We have a Emperor's Royal Guard here. Just a solid 3-4 here. You're not going to have Emperor Palpatine for the most part, but there are a few officials around. In fact, if we look back on Krennic here, you'll notice that this guy is also an official, so it does work with that, but you don't really care about the Sentinel necessarily. It's just a nice body to be playing earlier on. General Veers, basically a large portion of our earlier game plays, as well as both of our leaders are Imperial, and so it will buff up those guys as well. Baze, this guy works really well with Grand Inquisitor, as we've all established, but you also get the bonus from Krennic because you're going to ready him up and get that Krennic bonus. Agent Callus, this is one of those cards that normally I wouldn't run in a deck list, but because we are in Twin Suns, you will actually get quite a few card draw triggers. Remember, it's each round, and each round is a round of everyone going, not necessarily each turn like in Magic. So just because you've passed your action, remember, everyone else has to take their actions until they're finished, and then the round ends. So you can only get essentially 1 card per round. So this oftentimes draws 1 to 2 cards, but that's pretty solid. That also ends up being a 4/4 body. Rugged Survivors works really well with Grand Inquisitor and the Krennic buffs. Seventh Sister, just a solid unit, gets through the Sentinels and, potentially can start picking off opponents' units. Steadfast Battalion, we end up having a 5-costed leader and a 6-costed leader, but what's nice about it is most of the time people aren't going to deal with your leaders immediately, and they're not going to deal with your Steadfast Battalion immediately. So this kind of is a 7/7 for turn 5 or round 5. Rook, 3/6 shielded, just can start picking off random units. Remember, you could hit things like Reinforcement Walker or Emperor Palpatine and just kill them and keep your unit, which is really nice. Gideon Hask, this one is arguably, along with Super Laser Technician, the strongest card in the deck. It's between Super Laser and Gideon. I would put the edge towards Gideon in a more aggressive, combat-oriented meta, whatever that meta might be for you all. Gideon triggers on any enemy unit, which means all your opponent's training is just going to give you 1,000,000 experience tokens, which is so disgusting. So very powerful 5 resource unit here. We also have Academy Defense Walker. We're going to be pinging off our units very frequently, and so this is oftentimes going to give us 2 to 3 experience tokens when it comes down. And there's also a 5/5 Sentinel. Cargo Juggernaut synergizes well with Krennic, as Krennic is blue, so you will get that gain 4 when it comes down. He's also 4/6 shielded. 97th Legion, again, these games go long. This can sometimes be something like a 13-13, 14-14 type situation, which I've seen very frequently. Darth Vader, and this one is very expensive. Unlike anything else on this list, you do not need to run Darth Vader, but Darth Vader is still one of the strongest units in the game. If you're not going to run Darth Vader, I would recommend you running something like a Blizzard Assault AT-AT. That could be an easy replacement. You do want a little bit more high-end, and Darth Vader fills that role, so I'd run Darth Vader. You could also run Blizzard Assault AT-AT and Darth Vader, but something to consider. Just a very powerful unit that can get back things like, well, or get you things like Super Laser Tech, Del Meeko, Fifth Brother, General Veers, etc., etc. Count Dooku ends up being a removal spell, could sometimes finish off leaders for you and just comes down as a 5/4. Emperor Palpatine, someone who's just going to be a really strong unit, kind of picking off multiple enemy units. You could choose multiple people with multiple units, etc., etc. And lastly, we have Reinforcement Walker. This is a really nice late game engine. One of the cards I want to draw the most in every game alongside Gideon and Super Laser Tech. Between Reinforcement Walker, Gideon, and Super Laser Tech, these are my 3 favorite cards in terms of the ground units that we have. If you happen to have a Piet out, which I've done this before in draft a few times, put Piet out. Don't play him early. You do not want him to die, but use him as sort of a combat trick later on turn, 6 or so, assuming you didn't ramp. You could play Piet, and he's kind of an unassuming 1/4. Of course, if you've known what Piet does, and if you've seen him in other games, you might be a little worried because they might play their Reinforcement Walker and then immediately potentially draw 2 or heal 6, which could be really crazy, or even heal 3 and draw cards. So that's really powerful. So really solid ground unit selection, and well, there's a lot of things that synergize with the Krennic and Grand Inquisitor readying things up, but remember, we just get the value from Krennic, period. So you don't need to start readying things up, and if you have like a 97th Legion that has a point of damage on it, suddenly it just gets an extra point of power. And 97th Legion in this deck can really end games quickly, so just keep that in mind. But that's gonna be the ground units. Let's talk about space units. So unlike ground units, we have many fewer space units to choose from, and most of them are actually extremely expensive, but that's okay because we want to be playing those 9 and 10 drops in Twin Suns. As for lower drops, we got a couple here. We got Patrolling V-Wing and Inferno 4. Patrolling V-Wing is not a card I've played basically in any other deck. I've tried it. If you've played Magic before, things like 1/1 units that draw you a card are actually pretty good. The problem with this game oftentimes is that the drawing a card effect doesn't really synergize with the fact that you could already draw 2 resource whatever you want and you can't deploy all your cards. But when you're ramping and you want to be playing all your spells and playing a resource every single turn, drawing a card and getting something on the board that could potentially trade with like a TIE fighter is quite nice. We also have Inferno 4. As I mentioned, this can stack some cards on the top of your deck and just is a 2/3. You can ready it, making it a 3/1 with Grand Inquisitor on turn 1, which is pretty cool. Consortium Star Viper, if you happen to have the initiative It ends up giving you a little bit of restore, but we just need a little bit more presence in space. Tie and Advance. This card is arguably one of the strongest cards in our deck, period. And the main reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, Grand Inquisitor and Director Krennic are both Imperial units. So giving the 2 experience tokens to one of those units is extremely powerful. You could also give it to, you know, Veers or heck, even a Super Laser Tech. I advise waiting until a leader is deployed to get max value. System Patrol Craft, another little space value piece. Again, we just want a little bit of presence in space so we don't just get absolutely destroyed by someone playing a bunch of space units. Imperial Interceptor, very similar reason, acts as a little bit of a removal spell for space units as well as a decent body. And then we get to our late game finishers, similar to, you know, Reinforcement Walker, Palp, Vader, 97th Legion. The biggest finishers are the space units, actually. Relentless, Avenger, and Devastator. Relentless, again, says each opponent. This is really, really gross in Twin Suns, as basically, unless your opponents have multiple events, and even if they do have multiple events, they each have to do something to kill the Relentless. If you just deploy Relentless again, it could just be a nightmare. And remember, it says each opponent. It's not like the first event played by your opponents loses all abilities. It's each opponent. So a singular opponent has to have 2 events to deal with this thing, or just kill it off with their own space units. Avenger, this one not as like crazy scaling for Twin Suns, as it says an opponent chooses, not each opponent chooses. So you can't hit everyone, but it's still an 8/8 in the air and gets you to get a removal spell down, as well as continuously removing your opponent's units every single turn. And lastly, we have Devastator. This guy is the biggest finisher of the deck. It's a 10/10 Sentinel Overwhelm, and when you play it, you get to deal 10 damage, essentially, unless you have more, to something on the battlefield. This can one-shot a lot of leaders, especially if you're running like a Force leader or a couple of different Force leaders. It is an absolute beast of a ship and prevents basically anyone from killing you in space. So really powerful and really, really nice finisher for the space area. That's going to round it out, though, for space units. Let's talk about the events and upgrades. So one of the cool things about playing blue is that you get some really powerful events that really change the game of Twin Suns for you, specifically in the villainy category. Let's start off, though. We have Force Lightning. We have a few Force units, but we also specifically have Grand Inquisitor that can allow you to trigger Force Lightning. This is not super consistent, and so sometimes you just need to resource it because it just causes something to lose abilities, but even then, that could also be useful. We have a Resupply. This is extremely important, one of the most important cards in the entire deck, as you just can ramp out to your leaders a little bit earlier. Mission Briefing. This is a card, again, that I do not like in general for more competitive, non-multiplayer formats. But remember, it says choose a player. You get to choose, potentially, not yourself. And that can change some things if maybe you're trying to politic your way into maybe not getting attacked, or potentially maybe making someone else draw to their answer to the board state, etc. You could also just target yourself, which is going to be the vast majority of the time, and you're going to be able to leverage those cards oftentimes. Power of the Dark Side, just a nice solid early game removal spell. It really does well, especially if you can, again, politic your way with your opponents and say, hey, I have Power of the Dark Side. If you can kill this unit, I can kill this other one. Very much so. That is how it's used about 80% of the time. Search Your Feelings. This is, again, well, I should say again, this is just the best card in your deck because it's searching for whatever card you want at that given time. And since we're playing one of, Search Your Feelings ends up being a 2 of every single copy in the deck, which is really, really cool. So pretty straightforward there. Just gives you another copy of every card that you want. Takedown, very solid removal spell. I would limit yourself to really using this, or at least try to use it towards the leaders, as those ones are oftentimes the most impactful. Overwhelming Barrage, you will get in situations where you can Overwhelming Barrage a 97th Legion with 14 power, which ends up being 16 power, which ends up just annihilating your entire opponent's situation, entire board, and then going in and one-shotting someone with 97th Legion. I've done that several times, and it is incredibly fun. This is one of the better finishers, just because it's kind of like a one-sided board wipe. Vanquish, pretty straightforward, just a removal spell. Can't hit leaders. So this one, you're going to wait for their Avengers, their, Chimeras, their Devastators, and things like that. For Surrender, this is really, really nice. Again, this card says each opponent, you are able to potentially attack 3 different opponents and then make them all discard 2 cards. And it ends up being an 8-for-1 because you get to draw 2 cards. Then your opponents each discard 2 cards, which is being 6 cards, and then that's the result of the spell. Unlike in single player formats where it's just like, just make them discard 2, you draw 2, which is still solid, but oftentimes not worth playing for 6 resources. I like this one a lot. Vigilance. We have the multicolor aspects or the double aspect cards in the deck, mainly because, well, they're all just really powerful, and you will get to the 6 resources very frequently. And when you start diving into the one-ofs, you can only play one of all these different things in the decks, you start to, get to some really bad spells eventually. And these ones are not, so definitely worth paying the extra cost for them. Vigilance case, I oftentimes will be making people discard cards from decks. I will target people and just try to make them mill out because it does actually last that long. In some cases. The other case is that you just heal and defeat a unit. It's probably the most standard case. We have Aggression as well. Aggression also synergizes with the Grand Inquisitor, as you could potentially ready something like a 5th Brother. Well, play 5th Brother, ready it with Grand Inquisitor, and then ready it again with Aggression. You could also just draw cards. You can deal some damage and potentially defeat some upgrades if that's super relevant. Command is probably the best of these 3, as you are able to ramp with this, which is really nice, and you're able to play it as a removal spell or draw an additional card. Super Laser Blast is the last event we have here, and this card is absurd in a multiplayer format. We all know how powerful board wipes are in multiplayer formats if you've played something like Commander, but this, because we don't actually have that many wraths, and because people aren't thinking about this card, it comes down and it kills so many things. It can kill leaders as well. And so I've seen a situation where someone's deployed Palp, stolen someone else's stuff, and then, a couple other things happen, play a unit, play a unit, play a unit, and then boom, Super Laser Blast. And it's like, oh my gosh, this game's gonna last forever. So don't do it if you want the game to shorten, but very powerful card. We have 2 lightsabers at the end here, 2 upgrades. We have Vader's lightsaber and Fallen lightsaber. You do not need to attach this to Vader, and you do not need to attach this to a Force unit. I oftentimes just like one of these lightsabers in the early game to give myself a nice body so that I can easily block and trade, or trade up in terms of just taking a little bit of damage and killing their unit because of Vader's lightsaber or the Fallen lightsaber. So that is going to round out the deck list. Hopefully you all enjoy the Twin Suns deck. Again, if you want to pick up any of the cards here, be sure to check out TCG Player. There is no sideboard for this because it's a multiplayer format and there's no competitive nature necessarily to that. And so, well, join a game, load up your Krennic Grand Inquisitor, and have a good time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.